Man against nature.
Right, men. Push!
Two men battling the north of Australia. One an Englishman, leading an official and heavily equipped party. The other a Prussian, leading an unofficial and under-equipped party. Two very different men, but with one thing in common. They would never return. They would be the first expedition leaders to lose their own lives trying to explore Australia. In 1844, this tiny military post, Port Essington, was seen by the Australian colonists as the possible gateway to a rich trade with Asia and the British Empire. But there was no road to Port Essington, way up on the Coburg Peninsula of Arnhem Land. The nearest white settlers were far away on the Darling Downs. All the land between was unknown. The New South Wales government wanted an explorer to find a track to the northern coast.
Ready, sir.
Surveyor General Sir Thomas Mitchell shoved aside rivals like Eyre and Sturt and insisted on leading the expedition himself, as always with copious equipment of men and materials. But the government was slow to approve his expensive plans. Meanwhile, a small private expedition left the Darling Downs. It was bound for Port Essington and led by a man almost unheard of, Ludwig Leichhardt. Unlike his exploring rivals, Leichhardt was not a military man and had no experience of leadership. He was not even an Englishman, but a Prussian, or as Mitchell called him, a damned foreign coaster. Leichhardt started full of confidence, singing God Save the Queen with his companions. He reminded them that English and Prussians had fought on the same side at Waterloo. Some people thought this expedition was marching towards its own Waterloo, with an untried leader and too little food for such a long journey into unknown country. Leichhardt had a plan to travel amongst the headwaters of rivers, and this plan was to take him up the eastern slopes of the Great Dividing Range to the latitude of the Gulf of Carpentaria, then across the range and west below the Gulf to Arnhem Land, and finally northwest to Port Essington. This slow roundabout route would keep the men always on fresh water, but put dangerous strains on their food supplies and their goodwill towards Leichhardt. After 5 weeks of slow travelling through rugged country, it became apparent to Leichhardt that their rations would not last out the trip. 2 men turned back, and 8 went on. Leichhardt, 5 Englishmen, and 2 Aborigines. The 2 Aborigines, Harry Brown and Charlie Fisher, were Leichhardt's key men. He was determined to stay alive by living like them, off the land.
Today, Charlie killed an emu, and we busied ourselves extracting the oil from its skin. This we used to oil the locks of our firearms. I also consider it a good anti-rheumatic.
In fact, Leichhardt was one of the few explorers who attempted to survive on bush food.
Iguanas, possums, birds of all kinds have for some time past been most gladly consigned to our stewing pot. The dried kangaroo meat, one of our little luxuries, differs very little in flavor from the dried beef, and both, after long stewing, afford us an excellent broth.
By Christmas Day, 1844, the party had reached a spot they called Brown's Lagoon in the Christmas Ranges. and here they consumed a Christmas dinner of suet pudding and stewed cockatoos. As they travelled on, they came across native camps from which the blacks fled in terror at the sight of white men on horses who looked like centaurs. Leichhardt was eager to investigate the food supplies the blacks left behind. Turkey eggs, roasted bandicoots and yams. Some of his own attempts to live off the land were less successful. For instance, a meal of pods from a cassia shrub.
The seed when young had an agreeable taste, and the tissue when dry was pleasantly acidulous. They were eaten by some of my companions without any ill effect, whilst others, like myself, were severely purged.
Leichhardt was a great observer. His journal noted everything, from daily events to geology, from philosophy to botany. He collected thousands of plant specimens as he moved through this new country. It was hard going in the range country, and Leichhardt made it harder for his companions. He was determined to take a good look at everything, and his thoroughness made the expedition's progress even slower. The rest of the party were not so carried away by the joy of discovery. They were more concerned by the prospect of starving. More than half their basic ration of flour and dried beef was already gone, but they'd only done 1/7 of the journey. They bitterly criticised Leichhardt for providing too little, and he criticised them for expecting too much. In April 1845, Leichhardt reached this river, which he named the Burdekin, because of the help given to him by a Mrs. Burdekin of Sydney in outfitting this expedition. Other explorers of his day named things for British royalty and politicians in the hope of getting knighthoods. Leichhardt named them for the people who'd given him practical help, and so immortalised many not very well-known colonists of his day in the names of the rivers and ranges of northern Australia. Leichhardt followed the Burdekin past the present neighbourhood of Charters Towers and all the way up to its headwaters in the Great Dividing Range. Here he was able to cross the range and find the first northwestern flowing river, which he called the Lind. It was a sign they were approaching the long-sought Gulf of Carpentaria, but they were also approaching tragedy. Leichhardt's party had given up any pretense of keeping guard at night. It might have seemed justified, as they'd had no trouble with Aborigines, but this laxity would not have done for Major Mitchell, and it caught up with Leichhardt on the night of June the 28th, 1845, at a camp near the southeastern corner of the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Help! Mr. Leichhardt!
Charlie, rifles!
Natives had suddenly attacked us. They threw a shower of spears at the tents of Calvert, Roper, and Gilbert. Charlie and Brown discharged their guns into the crowd of natives, who instantly fled, leaving Calvert and Roper pierced by several spears and severely beaten by their bodies.
Mr. Roper.
Some of these spears were barbed and could not be extracted without difficulty.
My God.
Not seeing Mr. Gilbert, I asked for him.
Mr. Gilbert?
When Charlie told me our unfortunate companion was no more.
Leichhardt was horrified. Gilbert was dead, speared through the chest as he stepped out of his tent, which unfortunately faced away from the camp and in the direction of the attackers. The cause of this attack was unknown, although there were rumours that Leichhardt's Aboriginal guides had interfered with local tribal women. Whatever the cause, Leichhardt realised that if he camped here one more day, his expedition stood a good chance of being wiped out. So the first thing next morning, he loaded the wounded men on the horses and he broke camp. He left Gilbert in an unmarked and still undiscovered grave. Within a week, Leichhardt's party left Cape York behind and entered the Gulf country. They were still over 1,000 kilometres from Port Essington, but they now made good time across the dry Gulf country plains, in spite of the wounded men. Travelling northwest, parallel to the coast and just above the saltwater reaches of the rivers, they followed native tracks and found and named the Nicholson, Calvert, Robinson and MacArthur rivers. On October the 19th, 1845, 1 year after the expedition started, Leichhardt came to his biggest river.
I found myself on the banks of a large freshwater river. It was the river Mr. Roper had seen 2 days before, and I named it after him as I had promised to do. Natives seemed to be numerous, for the footpath along the lagoon was well beaten. Natives, crows, and kites were always indication of good country. Charlie, Jean, and Brown, who had been left at the lagoon to shoot waterfowl, returned with 51 ducks and 2 geese. They were all eaten for luncheon, dinner, and breakfast. If we had had 100 ducks, they would have been eaten as readily.
The Roper River was not all good news for Leichhardt's party. They were weary, their clothes were in tatters, and they were ravenously hungry. The men were depressed, and Harry Brown didn't help by continuously whistling the Dead March. Leichhardt was locked into the law of diminishing returns that plagued all explorers. The more of his beasts he killed for food, the less were left to carry the equipment. And here at the Roper River, he suffered a fearful blow when 4 of his remaining horses were drowned.
This disastrous event staggers me. I feel almost giddy, but there's no help. Unable to increase the load on my bullocks, I am forced to leave this part of my botanical collection which was carried by the horses. The fruit of many a day's work. Over 3,000 dried plants vanishes into smoke.
Leichhardt struggled on, leading his party across the rocky ridges of the Arnhem tableland, until they were halted by a wondrous sight, the South Alligator River. By the time Leichhardt's party had descended into the valley of the South Alligator River, their animals' hooves were splintered, all their gunshot was gone, and they were reduced to a diet of flying fox. They were all totally exhausted and completely unprepared for the next surprise of their journey.
A fine native stepped out of the forest. He was unarmed, and I received him most cordially. Come here. Come on. Come here.
Come here. Commandant, what's your name?
One can imagine the startling effect which his magic words produced. Our joys knew no limits. This man knew the white people at Port Essington.
Fed and guided by the friendly natives, Leichhardt and his men, with their last bullock, Redmond, were in Port Essington 2 weeks later. The first and last overland party to ever arrive at that remote spot. The Port Essington settlement was abandoned 4 years after Leichhardt's arrival. And here at the top of the Coburg Peninsula, there's little to show for what was to be the great trading port with India. Looking at this, it might seem that Leichhardt's achievement was pointless, but it was not. It was a tremendous journey of 15 months through 5,000 kilometres of unknown country, and it discovered much valuable land and added immensely to the knowledge of Australian geography. It was all the more remarkable because it was done with such poor equipment and by such an oddly assorted group of travellers. One man had been killed and 2 severely wounded on this trek. But Leichhardt, writing to his brother-in-law from the ship Heroine, en route from Port Essington to Sydney, showed little sympathy for his companions.
At the end of my journey, my party so harassed me that I doubt I could have put up with it for as much as another month. I was exhausted, the more spiritually than physically, by the time I arrived at Port Essington. You can well believe how little I enjoy associating with my tormentors now that the journey is over. I'm sick of the very sight of them.
Leichhardt's reception in Sydney in March 1846 was sensational. The newspapers announced that Leichhardt was back from the dead. He had long been given up for dead, and in Sydney, he had the unusual privilege of hearing his own funeral dirge, written by his friend Lind, to music by Isaac Nathan.
My name was on everybody's lips, for they were mourning for the poor unfortunate wanderer through the wilds of Australia. When nearly everybody had been affected by this prevailing mood of sorrow, I popped up out of my grave, my pockets full of fine discoveries and reports of new country. There is not a family in the colony who would not bid me a warm welcome just now. My name is a password to young Australians.
Leichhardt was hailed as the Prince of Explorers, and he and his party were given more than £2,500 by government grants and public subscription. He won the gold medal of the Royal Geographical Society, and he immediately announced plans for a new expedition. Leichhardt had travelled close to the coast of northern Australia. The Surveyor General, Sir Thomas Mitchell, had explored the inland up to the centre of Queensland, but the northern inland was still unknown. 2 years later, while Mitchell was on one of his prolonged absences in London, one of his assistants, a young Englishman named Edmund Kennedy, volunteered to find a track inland, north to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and then explore either west to Port Essington or east to Cape York. But Governor Fitzroy and Colonial Secretary Edward Dease Thompson seized the chance of Mitchell's absence in London to do some armchair planning.
Our plan, Mr. Kennedy, is to reverse the order of your progress and to land your party on the eastern shore of Cape York at Rockingham Bay. You will travel up the eastern coast, rendezvous with supply ships at Princess Charlotte Bay and Port Albany, explore the western coast of Cape York, and return south from the Gulf to the settled areas, thus linking the discoveries of Dr. Leichhardt and Sir Thomas Mitchell.
It was a grand plan, but with a fatal flaw. It would plunge Kennedy's expedition into some of Australia's most difficult terrain, the tropical rainforest of North Queensland. Edmund Kennedy was a brave and determined man. It was said of him in Sydney that he would either accomplish his object or leave his bones in the bush. He was not the kind of man to question his orders, but he must have had doubts about them when his expedition was landed here at Rockingham Bay, near the present town of Tully. As he looked around him, he realized that the way north was blocked by high mountain ranges. The way west was blocked by swamps.
I must confess, a viler-looking country never looked me in the face before. I must get inland as soon as possible, as the coast range will not permit the traveling of horse carts.
Kennedy decided that his only chance was to travel south until he could find a river to follow inland. In June 1848, the Kennedy expedition spent 4 valuable weeks moving along the beach, fording the mouths of 5 rivers and creeks until a westward track was found. At last, Kennedy was able to write something positive in his journal.
Tuesday, June 27th, 1848. Bid a hearty farewell to the beach at Rockingham Bay and started full of hope that this week's traveling would diminish the distance between us and Cape York.
Kennedy's expedition of 13 men included a young Aboriginal guide from the Hunter Valley of New South Wales. His name was Jackie Jackie. And like so many of the Aborigines enlisted for early expeditions, he was expected to communicate with tribes that he'd never met before and guide the expedition through country that was as foreign to him as it was to the European explorers. Kennedy was well armed and well equipped with 27 horses, 100 sheep, a ton of flour and 3 carts. But he wasn't prepared for country like this. He was now travelling up the Tully River Valley in a region renowned for Australia's highest rainfall. Can you imagine trying to force a flock of sheep through rainforest like this? Or trying to hack a path wide enough for a cart? This was Kennedy's nightmare. A maze of dense scrub and creepers and lawyer vine with barbs like fishhooks. When the 3 carts broke down and became bogged in the mud, Kennedy decided to abandon them. Eventually, Kennedy's men hacked their way out of the Tully Valley and up onto the high tablelands. At last it seemed they had escaped the coast. But Kennedy must have had dreadful worries. After 10 weeks, they were only 18 kilometres north of their landing site. They could not go back to Rockingham Bay because no ships had waited there. They were already overdue for their rendezvous with the ship Bramble at Princess Charlotte Bay, and they were 800 kilometres from the top of Cape York. The fate of the Kennedy party was now sealed. They were moving too slowly. Their supplies were running low. The men were weak and exhausted, and the local Aborigines were harassing these white intruders. The expedition staggered on through country which is hardly more settled today than it was in 1848, and by the middle of November, they reached Weymouth Bay. But now all their sheep were gone, and nearly all their flour, and 8 of the men were too weak to continue. Kennedy left them and pressed on with 4 other men. 12 days later, he had to leave 3 more men at Shelburne Bay. One of them, Costigan, had accidentally shot himself and was near death. With the Aboriginal guide Jackie Jackie, who'd turned out to be the most reliable member of the party, Kennedy made a last desperate dash to Port Albany. After 1 month of hacking their way through frightful scrub, they sighted their destination, 30 kilometres away. But they had no food left. They were down to their last 2 horses, and they were hemmed in, below the estuary of the Escape River. It was not an escape, but a trap, the last one for Kennedy.
Jackie, take cover!
Hostile tribesmen had been tracking them, and when the attack came, Kennedy's gunpowder was too wet to fire. Soon afterwards, Kennedy died in the arms of Jackie. 10 days after burying Kennedy's body, Jackie made it to Port Albany and was picked up by the ship Ariel. The ship sailed south to pick up the survivors. Kennedy's body was never found, nor the 3 men at Shelburne Bay. Only 2 of the 6 men at Weymouth Bay were found alive, and they were living skeletons. The expedition had been a disaster. 10 lives out of 13 were lost, and for no worthwhile result. Perhaps the greatest thing to emerge from the Kennedy expedition was the indomitable courage of Jackie. Except for him, nothing would be known of their fate. But 6 years later, in a drunken fall, he was burnt to death in a campfire near Albury. Kennedy's memorial in St. James Church, Sydney, was paid for by the government, and well it might have been, as a tribute to a gallant and unlucky man whose only fault was in trying to obey impossible orders. Nothing can ever excuse the choice of Rockingham Bay as a landing place for Kennedy's party. But there was an excuse for the reversal of his original plan to start from inland Queensland. Another expedition had already started from inland Queensland, before Kennedy. Ludwig Leichhardt was back in the field on his 3rd expedition. His 2nd had collapsed in sickness, wet weather, and a storm of abuse from his companions. On the 3rd expedition, his 6 companions were mystery men. But there was no mystery about Leichhardt's grand plan. He intended to strike north from the Barcoo to the Gulf Rivers, then due west across the continent, and then south to Perth. He calculated that this massive trek would take 2 years.
I am again ready to force my way into the interior of Australia. And if God grant me the strength, to go right across the continent. I cannot speak in too high terms of my present party, who seem to me well qualified for the long and tedious journey which is before us.
Those were the last words ever heard from Ludwig Leichhardt. He left the edge of settlement, Mount Abundance, on the Cocoon River, west of Roma, in April 1848. Somewhere out there, his entire party, with 8 horses, 50 bullocks and 20 mules, vanished. And to this day, nobody knows where their bones lie. In 1 year, 1848, Australian exploration suffered 2 terrible disasters. Leichhardt had completed one of the most remarkable overland journeys in history, and Kennedy had shown much promise. But in the end, both were remembered less for what they'd done than for how they were lost. Like Burke and Wills, soon to follow, they became a part of the Australian legend because they left their bones in the bush and their spirits to haunt the landscape forever.